Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere muddy, loud and absolutely soaking wet. The summer of 1969, when 500,000 Americans decided the best possible response to political chaos, a war nobody wanted, and the general state of the world was to drive to a dairy farm in upstate New York, take off their shoes and never quite put them back on again. Not the cleaned up poster on your college dorm wall version of Woodstock. I mean the real Woodstock. 3 days of music, mayhem, brown acid warnings over the PA system, and enough logistical catastrophe to make any modern event planner weep openly into their clipboard. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A genuinely huge thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and honestly, you have incredible taste. Comments like yours are what shape this channel, and I mean that sincerely. Drop a comment, telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow, it is always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find that deeply comforting. Also, the channel is now on Spotify, so if you'd like to drift off to this there instead, the link is waiting for you in the description. Now, dim those lights. Turn on a fan, pull your blanket up to your chin and let your feet sink into that mattress, because you're going nowhere tonight. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be at Woodstock? Not the mythology, the reality. Did people know it was going to be historic, or did it just feel like a very long, very wet mistake? What did 500,000 people eat when the food ran out? Who was supposed to be in charge, and how quickly did they realize they had absolutely no idea what they were doing? Could you survive 3 days sleeping in a field with no tent, no dry socks, and a stranger's elbow in your face and somehow still call it the greatest weekend of your life? And what would it take for the whole thing to collapse entirely into something genuinely catastrophic? Because, as it turns out, it came much closer than the history books like to admit. Congratulations. You've just woken up in August of 1969, specifically in a soggy field in Bethel, New York, which is emphatically not Woodstock, though nobody seems to care about that detail. You have no shoes. You may have lost your friends somewhere near the Hog Farm. Someone nearby is playing a flute badly, and you have absolutely no idea what the next 3 days have in store for you. Neither do the organisers, neither does anyone. Welcome to Woodstock. In the spring of 1969, 4 young men sat in a Manhattan office and decided they were going to put on the greatest music festival the world had ever seen. Their names were Michael Lang, Artie Kornfeld, Joel Rosenman, and John Roberts. Their combined experience in large-scale event management was, to put it generously, theoretical. Michael Lang had organised a festival in Miami the previous year that had gone reasonably well. The others had mostly enthusiasm, ambition, and crucially, John Roberts had a trust fund. They placed a small ad in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal advertising themselves as young men with unlimited capital looking for interesting projects. It was, in hindsight, the most reckless sentence ever put into a newspaper. Let's talk about the team for a second. Michael Lang was 24 years old. He had long curly hair, a motorcycle, and an aura of serene confidence that people would later describe as either visionary or deeply concerning depending on how the weekend turned out. Artie Kornfeld was a music industry insider who knew which phone calls to make. Joel Rosenman and John Roberts had met on a golf course, which is perhaps the least countercultural origin story in the history of a countercultural event, and had bonded over a shared desire to do something interesting with John's inherited money. What counts as interesting, of course, is entirely subjective. Most people would not define it as fund a music festival in a field for 500,000 people, but here we are. The original concept was modest, as these things always are before they aren't. The plan was to build a recording studio in Woodstock, New York, a quiet, artsy town in the Catskills where Bob Dylan had retreated after his motorcycle accident and where the band had been making music in a pink house in the woods. The festival was conceived as a promotional event attached to the studio, a relatively intimate gathering in a town already associated with musicians. 3 days of music, maybe 50,000 people, a tidy profit and a good story to tell. Simple, clean, achievable. None of those words apply to anything that happened next. Because the moment word went out that this festival was happening, something shifted. Acts started signing on. The lineup grew. The cultural moment, and 1969 had more cultural moment per square inch than almost any year in American history, began to press its weight against the original concept. The Vietnam War was killing tens of thousands of Americans. The civil rights movement had been met with assassination and violence. The previous summer had seen riots at the Democratic National Convention and cities burning. Young people across the country were not simply looking for a good concert. They were looking for proof that something else was possible. The four organisers, to their credit, sensed this. They may not have fully understood what they were building, but they understood it was bigger than a recording studio. The budget expanded. The ambitions expanded. The original plan for a modest upstate gathering began quietly transforming into something that none of them had the infrastructure, experience, or realistic financial model to pull off. And they pressed forward anyway, which is either the definition of courage or the definition of something else entirely, depending on whether you were one of the people who eventually had to clean up the field. What you should know, lying there in your clean, dry bed, is that the entire thing was set in motion by an ad in a newspaper and a trust fund. The greatest music festival in history began as a business venture dreamed up by 4 men in their 20s who had never done anything like it before. That is either deeply inspiring or the most alarming thing you've heard all week. Possibly both. What you need for a music festival is, at minimum, a large piece of land whose owner is willing to let 500,000 people park on it. This turns out to be a surprisingly rare combination of requirements. The original plan was to build a recording studio in Woodstock, New York, a quiet artist's town in the Catskills where Bob Dylan and the band had been living and recording. The festival was conceived as a kind of promotional event attached to it. But as the guest list grew and the ambitions expanded, a studio was no longer enough. They needed a field. They found one in Wallkill, New York, signed a lease, and began construction, until the town of Wallkill, quite reasonably upon reflection, passed a local ordinance requiring any outdoor gathering of more than 5,000 people to obtain a special permit, and then declined to issue one. Picture the scene. It is mid-July of 1969. The festival is scheduled for August 15th. Construction has already begun on the Wallkill site. Stage foundations are in. Infrastructure is being laid. And then the town government, having taken a long, hard look at what is coming their way, essentially said, "No thank you, and would you please stop building things on that field?" The permit was denied. The lease was voided. And the Woodstock team found themselves in the specific kind of panic that comes from having made large, expensive, irreversible commitments based on a plan that has just ceased to exist. With less than 6 weeks to go, they needed a new venue. This is roughly equivalent to planning a wedding, booking the caterers, printing the invitations, and then discovering that the venue is cancelled, except that instead of 200 guests, you're expecting somewhere between 50,000 and increasingly a great many more. You do the venue search not at a relaxed pace with spreadsheets and site visits, but in a cold sweat, making phone calls to anyone in a 3-county radius who owns a flat piece of land and might, under the right financial incentives, consider lending it to the youth of America for a long weekend. The search was real, frantic, and not pretty. Several properties were considered and rejected, too small, wrong terrain. Owners who took one look at the proposed crowd size and laughed. the organisers fanned out across the Catskills region, making increasingly urgent pitches to increasingly sceptical landowners. Time was compressing, acts had been booked, tickets had been printed and sold, approximately 186,000 of them, which is a lot of people to call and say, actually, we don't know where this is happening yet. Meanwhile, word of the festival was spreading in ways that made the original 50,000 estimate feel like a rounding error. Stories were appearing in the underground press, flyers were circulating. The cultural gravity of the thing, the lineup, the moment, the feeling that something important was about to happen somewhere in upstate New York, was pulling people toward it faster than any of the logistics could keep up with. What the organisers needed was not just land. They needed someone willing to absorb the uncertainty, the risk, the genuine possibility that their property would be transformed into something unrecognisable by the time it was over. What they needed, in short, was a very specific kind of stubborn, principled, slightly impractical person, and they were about to find one on a dairy farm in a town called Bethel, in a conversation that would determine the shape of an entire cultural era. The lesson here, as you settle further into your pillow, is a simple one. Almost everything that made Woodstock possible was an accident. The venue most certainly was. Max Yasgur was a dairy farmer in Bethel, New York. He was 50 years old, conservative, not particularly countercultural, and the owner of 600 acres of rolling green farmland that happened to include a long, gentle slope that looked, from a certain angle, like a natural amphitheatre. He was also, as it turned out, a man of unexpected principle. When the organisers came to him desperate and slightly wild-eyed, with less than 6 weeks to go, Yasgur listened to the pitch. His neighbours were furious. Local business owners threatened boycotts of his dairy operation. His wife had concerns. None of it moved him. Sit with Max Yasgur for a moment, because he deserves it. He was not a hippie. He did not share the politics or the aesthetics of the crowd that was about to descend on his land. He was a businessman, a farmer, a member of a conservative rural community that had, quite reasonably, no desire to become the temporary home of 500,000 young people with long hair and complicated ideas about property. His neighbours were not shy about making their feelings known. Some refused to sell him dairy supplies. Others confronted him directly. The social pressure was real, sustained, and coming from people he had lived among for years. Yasgur's response to all of this was, by most accounts, simply that he believed in the right of people to assemble. He had grown up in a country where that right was considered fundamental, and he was not interested in being the person who denied it because it was inconvenient. He had watched the news that summer. He had seen what happened when young people gathered to protest and were met with force. His farm was an alternative to that, a place where the gathering could happen without confrontation, without violence, without the machinery of authority pressing down on it. He charged the organisers a reported $75,000 for the use of his land. Given what was about to happen to it, this was either a fair price or a tragically low one depending on how you calculate the value of 600 acres of stripped topsoil. He shook hands on the deal and went back to his dairy operation, which continued running throughout the festival, his cows apparently unmoved by the presence of hundreds of thousands of music fans on the other side of the fence. During the festival itself, Yasgur appeared on the stage briefly to speak to the crowd. The moment has been recorded and preserved. He stood at the microphone, a middle-aged dairy farmer in a clean shirt, and told 500,000 people that they had proven something to the world, that 500,000 kids could get together and have fun and music and nothing but fun and music. The crowd responded with a roar that shook the stage. It was one of the more unlikely moments of mutual recognition in American history. A conservative farmer and a generation of young people, briefly, improbably, on exactly the same page. His neighbours never fully forgave him. His farm took years to recover. and Max Yasgur, who had not asked to be a symbol of anything, became one anyway. Proof that sometimes the most important person in a historical moment is not the visionary or the performer or the crowd, but the quiet, stubborn individual who simply decides to say yes when everyone around them is saying no. Sleep on that for a moment. It's worth it. The festival was scheduled for August 15th through the 17th of 1969. The lease on Yasgur's farm was signed in late July. That left approximately 6 weeks to build a stage, a sound system, sanitation facilities, food vendors, medical stations, fencing, parking infrastructure, and everything else required to safely host what the organisers were now quietly admitting might be somewhere in the range of 50,000 to 200,000 people. It was an impossible timeline delivered to a construction crew that was making it up as they went along. To be clear about the scale of what was being attempted, a permanent music venue of this size would normally take years to plan and build. Woodstock was attempting something comparable in about 40 days on a dairy farm without a completed blueprint, with a budget that was already hemorrhaging money, and with a guest list that was growing faster than any infrastructure could accommodate. The stage alone, a massive cantilevered wooden structure designed to hold musicians, equipment and lighting rigs, was a significant engineering undertaking. It was designed by a team that included people who had never built a concert stage before, which sounds alarming until you realise that in 1969 very few people had built a concert stage of this size before. The profession was essentially being invented as the stage went up. The sound system was similarly unprecedented. The goal was to deliver clear audio to an outdoor audience that might number in the hundreds of thousands, a technical challenge that pushed beyond the limits of existing equipment. Engineers worked around the clock designing and building a system specifically for the festival. Towers went up across the field to distribute sound. Speaker clusters were assembled. Cables were run through mud. The whole thing was, from an audio engineering standpoint, a genuine innovation, born not from careful research and development, but from the specific pressure of an impossible deadline. Meanwhile, the sanitation planning was proceeding on the assumption of perhaps 50,000 people. Water lines were dug. Portable toilet units were ordered in numbers that seemed at the time generous. Food vendor. Spaces were laid out. Parking areas were designated. A medical station was established. On paper, the infrastructure was adequate for the crowd the organisers officially expected. The crowd the organisers privately suspected was coming was another matter entirely. Because the tickets were selling, not trickling in, selling. By early August, well over 100,000 tickets had moved, and the pace was accelerating. People in the underground press were calling Woodstock the event of the generation. The word was spreading through campuses and communes and coffee shops, and anywhere young people gathered and talked about what was happening in the country and what might be possible. The organisers looked at the ticket numbers, looked at their infrastructure, and then apparently decided that the best course of action was to keep building as fast as possible and hope that the gap between what they had and what they needed would somehow close itself. It did not close itself, but the building continued, frantic, loud, improvised, occasionally brilliant, and operated by a workforce that ranged from professional contractors to volunteers who had simply shown up and been handed a hammer. 6 weeks is not enough time to build a city, but it is apparently just barely enough time to build the outline of one if you are willing to accept that many of the walls won't be finished and several of the systems will fail, and the whole thing will be held together, in the end, by the collective improvisation of the people inside it, which is, in a way, a reasonable description of most cities. Getting the acts to agree to play Woodstock was, at least in retrospect, the part that went well. The lineup that eventually committed to Bethel in August of '69 reads today like a list somebody assembled specifically to make music fans weep with longing. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Who, Jefferson Airplane, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Joan Baez, Grateful Dead, Sly, and the Family Stone, Santana, Joe Cocker, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, many of them performing together publicly for the first time. The booking was handled primarily by Michael Lang and a small team working out of the Manhattan office, making calls and sending contracts at a pace that suggested either supreme confidence or a complete inability to acknowledge the possibility of failure. Acts were offered between $10,000 and $18,000 each, which was a reasonable fee for the era and enough to bring in most of the people they called. The important thing to understand is that Woodstock's reputation in the summer of '69 was not yet what it would become. The acts who signed on were not signing on because they knew it would be historic. They were signing on because the money was fair, the lineup was impressive, and the countercultural community they were part of had decided this was the event to be at. The mythology came later. At the time, it was just a gig. The refusals are, in their own way, as interesting as the acceptances. The Doors declined. Jim Morrison was reportedly skeptical about festival crowds. This from a man who had recently been arrested on stage in Miami for what a prosecutor described as lewd and lascivious behaviour, so his threshold for concern about a crowd was calibrated in a particular direction. Led Zeppelin's manager Peter Grant said the band didn't do festivals, which was a consistent policy, and also meant they were not at Woodstock, a fact that continues to haunt the band's historical record in ways that no amount of stadium tours has fully resolved. And then there was Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan, who literally lived in Woodstock, New York, who had given the town its cultural identity, who was, in the summer of '69, probably the single most mythologically significant figure in American music. Bob Dylan was invited to Woodstock and declined, then performed the following week at the Isle of Wight Festival in England, which is roughly the equivalent of being invited to your own surprise party, and choosing instead to attend a function in another country. The reasons are murky. Dylan was protective of his privacy, particularly after the motorcycle accident that had interrupted his career 3 years earlier. He may have been alarmed by the size of the gathering. He may simply have had other plans. Whatever the reason, the most famous resident of Woodstock was absent from Woodstock, and the universe has apparently decided to let that irony stand. What the lineup represented, for the people who made it out to Bethel, was something beyond a concert bill. It was a gathering of a generation's creative output in a single field, every strand of what popular music had become in the 1960s, from folk to rock to blues to soul to psychedelia, assembled on one stage over 3 days. You could not have assembled that lineup at any other moment in history. It required exactly the convergence of talent, timing and cultural pressure that existed in the summer of '69 and nowhere else. The acts who said yes did not know what they were walking into, but they walked in anyway. The fence was supposed to go up around the entire venue. Tickets had been sold, around 186,000 of them, at $7 a day or $18 for the full weekend, which was how the organisers planned to pay for everything they'd already spent. The fence, when the time came to complete it, was simply not finished. Construction had fallen behind. And as the days leading up to August 15th ticked by, it became clear that the number of people converging on Bethel was going to vastly, wildly exceed any previous estimate. The fence was not a minor detail. It was the entire financial architecture of the festival. Without the fence, there was no controlled entry. Without controlled entry, there was no ticket collection. Without ticket collection, there was no revenue. And without revenue, there was no way to pay for the stage, the sound system, the talent fees, the sanitation, the food vendors, the medical staff, or any of the other expenses that had been accumulating since the Wallkill disaster. The fence was, in short, the thing that was supposed to turn Woodstock from a very large, very expensive idea into a functional business. When it became clear, on the morning of August 14th, the day before the music was supposed to start, that completing the fence in time was not realistic, The organisers faced a choice. They could attempt to enforce ticketing without the fence, which would have required turning away an unknown but enormous number of people who had driven hundreds of miles to get there, many of them without tickets, many of them with limited patience for being redirected. They could attempt to add additional staff to cover the gaps in the perimeter, or they could accept the situation as it was and declare the festival free. They declared it free. The announcement was made over the radio in the PA system, and it was received by the incoming crowd with approximately the level of enthusiasm you would expect. What it meant in practical terms was that Woodstock Ventures was now absorbing the full cost of the festival with no mechanism for recovery. John Roberts' trust fund, already substantially depleted, was about to take a hit that would take years to work off. The organisers had effectively gifted the festival to the crowd, not out of idealism, but out of the specific pragmatism of having no realistic alternative. The decision was framed publicly as a gesture of generosity, which is technically true in the same way that leaving your umbrella at home and getting soaked is technically a gesture of trust in the weather. The crowd received it as confirmation that the spirit of the festival was exactly what they had hoped it would be: free, open, communal, a temporary suspension of the normal rules of commerce and entry and exclusion. The mythology of Woodstock as a free event, as a gift to a generation, has its roots in a construction delay and a fence that never got finished. There are worse origin stories, but you should know where yours came from. New York State Route 17. B was not designed to handle the volume of traffic that began arriving in Bethel on Wednesday, August 13th, 2 days before the music was even scheduled to start. By Thursday evening, the highway had become the longest parking lot in American history. Cars were abandoned on the road by people who simply stepped out, grabbed their sleeping bags, and walked the remaining miles to the farm. Picture the highway. It is a 2-lane road through rural Sullivan County, the kind of road built for farm trucks and local commuters, not for the vehicular output of a generation in motion. And yet, from Wednesday onward, it was receiving what one estimate placed at 1 million vehicles over the course of the weekend, not all at once, obviously, but in a sustained, relentless flow that the road simply could not process. The cars backed up. Then the backup extended. Then the extended backup backed up further. By Thursday afternoon, the jam stretched for approximately 20 miles in multiple directions, and the people at the back of it were making a simple calculation. The car is not moving. The festival is theoretically within walking distance, and the alternative is sitting in a hot vehicle on a rural highway with no air conditioning and an AM radio. Many of them got out and walked. The New York State Thruway, one of the primary arterial highways of the eastern seaboard, had to be officially closed. This is not a small thing. Closing a major interstate highway is an emergency measure. It disrupts commerce, emergency services, and the movement of people across an entire region. The Thruway was closed because it had essentially ceased to function as a highway and had become an auxiliary parking facility. State troopers who had been dispatched to manage traffic found themselves managing something that had moved beyond the category of traffic into something closer to a slow-motion migration. Helicopters became the primary logistics solution. Performers were flown in. Food and supplies were flown in. The medical team used helicopters to move critical patients out. Equipment that hadn't arrived by road before the jam solidified was brought in by air. The sight of helicopters ferrying Janis Joplin and Creedence Clearwater Revival over a sea of stalled cars toward a dairy farm in the Catskills is one of the more quietly surreal images of the whole event. The infrastructure of warfare pressed into service for a peace festival because the roads had stopped working. Local residents who needed to get anywhere, to work, to shop, to a hospital, found themselves effectively marooned. The town of Bethel had not agreed to become an island, and yet, for 3 days, that is more or less what it was. A community surrounded by a sea of people and vehicles, accessible only from the air, cut off from the normal rhythms of everyday life by the sheer weight of a cultural moment arriving all at once. Most residents were not, as the mythology sometimes suggests, uniformly delighted about this. But many of them, faced with the reality of what was happening, responded with the kind of practical generosity that makes the whole story something other than a simple disaster. More on that shortly. The original plan had accounted for somewhere around 50,000 attendees. The sanitation infrastructure, the portable toilets, the water lines, the waste management systems had been built around that number, perhaps stretched generously to accommodate a bit more. What arrived was closer to 450,000 people, with estimates ranging to 500,000 at peak. Let's be precise about the mathematics here, because they are instructive. The festival had approximately 600 portable toilet units on site when the gates opened, or would have opened if there had been functioning gates, which there were not, but the point stands. 600 units for, at minimum, 450,000 people works out to roughly 750 people per toilet. Modern event planning guidelines recommend one toilet per 50 to 75 people for a music festival. Woodstock was operating at approximately 10 to 15 times that ratio. You do not need a degree in public health to understand that this was going to create problems. The problems arrived quickly and comprehensively. The portable units filled within the first day. The honey wagon, the truck responsible for pumping and emptying the units, could not reach the site because the roads were impassable. The units that were full stayed full. People began improvising. The streams and ponds around the farm became simultaneously bathing facilities and something else, which created a compounding problem that the organisers had not planned for, and the local water table was not particularly interested in absorbing gracefully. The water lines, designed for a fraction of the actual crowd, became overwhelmed. Water pressure dropped. Certain areas of the site had no functioning water access at all. The medical team began monitoring for dehydration as temperatures climbed through the day, because a crowd of 500,000 people in August heat without reliable water access is a public health scenario with a fairly predictable trajectory. Volunteers hauled water by hand to areas where the lines had failed. The Hog Farm, more on them later, set up their own water distribution points. The improvised infrastructure that kept people hydrated was built not from planning, but from the real-time recognition that people needed water, and someone had to provide it. The smell, by the second day, had acquired what eyewitnesses consistently describe with a kind of awed, retrospective disbelief. It was the smell of a city that had arrived without its sewage system, which is precisely what it was. And yet, remarkably, the sanitation failure did not produce the epidemic that public health officials feared and quietly prepared for. The overall health outcomes, given the conditions, were far better than the infrastructure deserved. The reasons for this are a combination of good luck, the improvised community response, and the fact that most people were there for only 3 days, which is not quite long enough for certain kinds of cascading failure to fully develop. It came close, though. Closer than the documentary shows. The catering plan for Woodstock had been arranged for a fraction of the crowd that showed up. By Friday, the food vendors, hot dog stands, a few concession booths, a couple of enterprising entrepreneurs with grills were overwhelmed and then simply out of supplies. The surrounding towns, alarmed and unprepared, initially resisted helping. Stores had been cleared out by arriving festival goers in the days before, and then something interesting happened. Let's start with what the food situation actually looked like on the ground, because it is instructive in the way that only genuine emergencies are instructive. The official vendors had set their supply levels based on the expected crowd, somewhere between 50 and 100,000 people, depending on which optimistic estimate they were working from. When the actual crowd materialized at roughly 5 to 10 times that scale, the math collapsed immediately. A hot dog stand with inventory for 50,000 people does not become adequate for 400,000 people through positive thinking. The vendors ran out. Some of them ran out on the first day. The surrounding communities had spent the preceding weeks watching the festival preparations with a mixture of curiosity and alarm. Local grocery stores and general stores had been depleted by the arriving crowd before the music even started, people stocking up on food, bottled water and supplies for what they expected would be a self-sufficient camping situation. What they had not anticipated, largely because nobody had, was that the self-sufficient camping situation would be undermined by the sheer density of people and the impossibility of preparing and storing food at that scale in a field. Into this gap stepped, unexpectedly, almost everyone. The Hog Farm, the communal group that had been brought in for security and general support, set up a free kitchen that served granola and bulgur wheat and oatmeal to anyone who walked up to it. Wavy Gravy, the Hog Farm's leader, announced from the stage that breakfast in bed was available for 400,000 people. The crowd, by all accounts, found this genuinely funny and genuinely appreciated it. Local churches in the surrounding towns began making sandwiches. Not a few sandwiches, thousands upon thousands of sandwiches assembled by volunteers, working through the night. Women's organisations, civic groups, church ladies who had not necessarily expressed much sympathy for the festival's politics, found themselves in their fellowship halls building food for the people on the hill, because the people on the hill were hungry and that was the relevant fact. One Bethel resident drove a truck of food to the site boundary and handed things out the window for hours. The US Army, the same institution the crowd was broadly protesting, flew in food supplies by helicopter. People shared what they had with strangers. This is the part of the story that tends to get flattened into mythology and deserves to be stated plainly. When the systems failed, people fed each other. Not because there was a plan or an instruction or a financial incentive, but because there were hungry people nearby and they had food and sharing. It was the obvious thing to do. The official structures collapsed. The informal ones held. Nobody starved. Given everything, that is the most remarkable sentence in the Woodstock story. At some point on Saturday afternoon, a voice came over the PA system at Woodstock and delivered one of the most memorably surreal public health announcements in the history of public address. To get back to the warning that I've received, you might take it with however many grains of salt you wish, that the brown acid that is circulating around us isn't too good. It is suggested that you stay away from it. The voice belonged to Chip Monk, who had been hired as the festival's lighting designer and found himself, through the specific chaos of that weekend, also functioning as the primary stage announcer. He read the announcement the way a flight attendant might describe the location of the emergency exits, calmly, clearly, with a tone that suggested this was a routine part of the program rather than a public health intervention being delivered to several 100,000 people, some of whom were actively in the process of making the decision the announcement was advising them against. The brown acid was a batch of LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, to give it its full name, which is a name that sounds considerably more clinical than the experience it describes, that had been circulating through the crowd and producing results at the more distressing end of the spectrum. The medical tent had been receiving people in states of significant psychological distress from it throughout the day. The decision to make the announcement was practical. If you could reach 400,000 people over the PA and warn even a fraction of them off a substance that was sending people to the hospital, the intervention was worth making. What made the announcement immortal was the phrase "however many grains of salt you wish." It is the verbal equivalent of a shoulder shrug. It acknowledges that the audience is adults, that the information is advisory rather than regulatory, and that the festival's relationship with its crowd was not one of authority and obedience, but of something looser and more honest. The organisers were not pretending that drug use was not happening. They were addressing it directly and trusting the crowd to make their own decisions with the information provided. This was either a philosophically coherent approach to harm reduction or a remarkable piece of accidental public health messaging, possibly both. The announcement was made approximately 3 times over the weekend. Each time, Chipmunk delivered it with the same measured calm. Each time, the crowd absorbed it and continued doing whatever the crowd was doing. The medical tent continued to receive patients. The festival continued. The brown acid continued to circulate, because an announcement over a peer system is not, it turns out, the most effective tool for removing a substance from a field containing 500,000 people. But the announcement was made, the information was provided, and the specific, unhurried decency of its phrasing, the suggestion rather than the command, the grains of salt, the soft acknowledgement that some of you are going to do whatever you're going to do, and we'd just like you to have the facts, is one of the more quietly remarkable artifacts of the entire weekend. It is also, if you think about it, the most 1969 sentence ever spoken into a microphone. Dr. William Abruzzi was the chief medical officer for Woodstock, and the story of what he and his team managed over those 3 days deserves its own documentary series. The medical infrastructure had been designed for a much smaller crowd. What arrived was a city, a sudden, unplanned city of 500,000 people, many of whom were dehydrated, sunburned, injured from falls in the mud, experiencing bad drug reactions, going into labour, or simply in need of basic care they hadn't been able to access for 3 days. Let's talk about what the medical tent actually looked like from the inside. It had been established, with supplies and staffing appropriate for a modest outdoor event, a reasonable number of cots, basic first aid equipment, a small pharmacy of emergency medications, and a team of medical professionals who had agreed to spend their weekend providing healthcare to a festival crowd. What they received instead was the unannounced arrival of something closer to a field hospital during a slow-moving natural disaster. The cot count was inadequate within hours. The medication supplies were under pressure by the end of the first day, and the range of conditions presenting for treatment expanded well beyond anything the original planning had anticipated. The cases coming through the tent were a compressed catalogue of what happens when 500,000 people spend 3 days in a field without adequate food, water, sanitation, or shelter. Dehydration was constant and widespread. Sunburn moved quickly into heat exhaustion for people who'd been standing in an August field since Wednesday, without shade or sufficient water. Cuts and puncture wounds from broken glass and debris were common. The field was not clean, and bare feet, which a remarkable number of people were wearing by day 2, encountered things that bare feet should not encounter. There were fractures, sprains, and injuries from crowd compression. There were asthma attacks triggered by smoke from fires throughout the site. There were allergic reactions. There were insulin emergencies. There was, by all accounts, a great deal of ordinary human fragility arriving at a tent that had been built for a smaller, simpler version of human fragility. And then there were the drug-related presentations. The medical team had anticipated some volume of bad psychedelic experiences. This was a music festival in 1969, and whoever planned the medical response was not naive about the crowd's recreational habits. What they received was a sustained, significant flow of people in acute psychological distress, most of them experiencing what the era called bad trips, and what the medical literature called acute anxiety reactions to hallucinogens. The Hog Farm's contribution here was genuinely important. They had experience in communal settings managing exactly this kind of situation, and they established what was essentially a talk-down station adjacent to the medical tent, a calm, low-stimulation space where trained volunteers sat with distressed individuals and guided them through the experience rather than immediately escalating to medical intervention. It worked remarkably well. The collaboration between the credentialed medical team and the informal communal knowledge of the Hog Farm was one of the more quietly effective partnerships of the entire weekend. 3 people died at Woodstock over the 3 days. 1 overdosed on heroin. One was a teenager who was run over by a tractor while sleeping in a sleeping bag in a field, a tragedy that sits outside the festival narrative but belongs in the honest account of it. One died of a ruptured appendix. 3 deaths over 3 days for a population of 500,000 is a mortality rate that stunned public health officials who had prepared contingency plans for something significantly worse. It is not a number to celebrate because 3 people did not go home, but it is a number that, in context, speaks to something remarkable about what the medical team accomplished in a tent that was never supposed to handle what it handled. 3 babies were born on site. They reportedly had the best stories of anyone there. Saturday evening, the skies over Bethel opened up. The rain was not a light summer shower. It was a serious, prolonged downpour that turned the already churned farmland into something approaching a shallow lake of brown mud. The stage crew scrambled to protect the electrical systems. Tarps were thrown over equipment. Performers were pulled back. For a few tense hours, there was a genuine possibility that the entire festival would have to be halted, not for philosophical reasons or logistical failures, but because electrocuting several 100,000 people in a mudfield is considered bad event management. Here is what the stage area looked like when the rain began. The ground had already been worked by 400,000 pairs of feet for 2 full days. The grass was gone. What remained was compacted earth that, under a sustained downpour, became a surface with the friction coefficient of a skating rink and the aesthetic quality of a construction site after a river has run through it. Cables were buried in it. Electrical connections were exposed to it. The stage, which had been built on a wooden platform above the field, was holding, but the area around it was rapidly becoming a moat. The electrical team faced a specific and very serious problem. The sound system, the lighting rigs, and the stage monitors were all running on power that was being delivered through cables lying on or near the surface of a field that was rapidly filling with water. Water and electricity have a relationship that is well understood and unanimously described as problematic. The crew worked quickly, elevating cables, wrapping connections, rerouting power where they could. It was the kind of improvisational engineering that happens when trained people are operating at the outer edge of what they know how to do, under time pressure, in the rain. The performers who were scheduled to go on during the storm were held backstage. Some of them waited for hours. The crowd, which had no backstage to retreat to, sat in the rain, or stood in it, or danced in it, which a significant number of people did, apparently deciding that being soaking wet was a condition rather than a problem, and that the condition did not preclude dancing. There is something genuinely admirable about this response, though it is also possible that after 2 days in a field, the additional variable of rain simply did not register as a meaningful change in circumstances. What did not happen is as important as what did. The crowd did not panic. There were no rushes toward the exits, partly because the exits were not clearly defined, but also because the crowd had developed, over 2 days of shared improvisation, a collective patience that held even under the rain. People covered themselves with whatever they had, plastic sheeting, ponchos, garbage bags, each other. They waited. And when the rain stopped and the music resumed, the field erupted with the particular relief of people who have sat through something together and come out the other side of it. The mud that remained after the rain became one of the defining images of the festival. People slid down the hillside in it. They threw it. They wore it. It filled shoes and sleeping bags and the treads of boots that would carry traces of a Sullivan County dairy farm back to apartments in New York and Boston and Chicago, deposited on kitchen floors days later, like small dried dispatches from another world. The electrical system survived, the festival survived, and the mud became, somehow, a souvenir. Jimi Hendrix was supposed to close Woodstock on Sunday night. He ended up playing on Monday morning. By the time Hendrix took the stage, the crowd of 400,000 had thinned considerably. Many people had already begun the long walk back to their cars, or simply needed to be back at work in the morning, because real life did not pause for Woodstock. The people who stayed were rewarded with what many critics consider the definitive performance of the 1960s, a 40-minute set that included a version of the Star-Spangled Banner that dismantled and reassembled the national anthem into something raw, beautiful, and permanently controversial. Let's back up to how Hendrix ended up playing at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning to a crowd that was a fraction of what it had been 24 hours earlier. The scheduling delays that, accumulated over 3 days, had pushed every act further and further from its original slot. Rain, technical failures, the sheer logistical weight of moving performers and equipment in a field with no functional roads, all of it compounded. Hendrix, who had been booked as the closing act and had agreed to headline the festival at what was then his asking price of $18,000, had been waiting since Sunday night. He waited through the small hours. He waited as the sky began to lighten. By the time his band, a new configuration he called Gypsy Sun and Rainbows, an expanded group that included 2 additional musicians, finally took the stage, it was past 9 in the morning and the festival was technically over. The crowd that remained was perhaps 30 to 40,000 people, still an enormous number by any normal standard, but a ghost town compared to the peak attendance. They were exhausted. Many had slept in the mud. Many had not slept at all. They had been there for days, and they had stayed. And the reason most of them gave afterward for staying was Hendrix. He played for approximately 2 hours. The set ranged across his catalogue, originals, blues covers, psychedelic improvisations, and built toward the moment that has defined its place in history. When Hendrix began playing the Star-Spangled Banner, unaccompanied by his band, he was doing something that had not been done to the national anthem before. He used the guitar not to ornament the melody but to break it apart, running the notes through feedback and whammy bar distortion, to produce sounds that people in the crowd recognized immediately as the sounds of the war. Sirens, bombs, the whistle of incoming fire. The anthem reassembled on the other side of the chaos, bruised and somehow more honest for it. The interpretation was controversial in ways that would follow Hendrix for the rest of his life, which was less than a year. He was asked repeatedly whether his version was meant as a protest. He said he thought it was beautiful. Both things were true. He had less than 13 months left to live when he stood on that stage in the Monday morning light, playing the national anthem of a country that was at war with itself to the survivors of a weekend that had briefly suggested another way of being. He died in September of 1970. He was 27 years old. The people who stayed for the Monday morning set did not regret it. The Woodstock mythology tends to cluster around a handful of iconic moments. Hendrix's anthem, Janis Joplin's raw power, Joe Cocker's whole experience of his own body while singing. But the festival ran continuously for 3 days, and the lineup was far longer and stranger than the highlight reel suggests. Sha Na Na performed at Woodstock. Sha Na Na, a doo-wop revival group in gold lame jackets who did 50s covers, played the second to last slot before Hendrix, which remains one of the more disorienting programming choices in music history. Let's spend a moment with Sha Na Na, because they deserve it, and because their presence at Woodstock is the kind of historical detail that, once you know it, you cannot unknow. They were a Columbia University group who had formed less than a year before the festival. Their act was a loving, slightly campy recreation of 1950s rock and roll, slicked back hair, choreographed moves, songs that the Woodstock crowd's older siblings had grown up on. They performed immediately before Jimi Hendrix, in front of 450,000 people at the defining event of the countercultural movement, in gold lame jackets, and by all accounts they were very good, and the crowd responded warmly, and the whole thing is somehow perfectly Woodstock in its refusal to be only one thing. Melanie Safka was a 22-year-old folk singer who had released one album and was not particularly well known when she was booked to perform. She was scheduled for a daytime slot and ended up playing during a rainstorm, standing at the microphone in the downpour, singing to hundreds of thousands of people who were sheltering under whatever they could find. The experience affected her profoundly. She wrote Candles in the Rain about it, a song that became her breakthrough and her signature, built entirely out of what she saw from that stage. Hundreds of thousands of people lighting candles and lighters in the dark as she sang. A gesture of community so large it was visible from the stage as a field of small flames. She had arrived as a relatively unknown act. She left as someone the festival had permanently marked. The Keith Hartley Band made a different kind of history. They were a British blues rock group who performed at Woodstock, and then, in a decision their fans have been processing ever since, declined to appear in the documentary film. Their reasoning was reportedly that they did not want the exposure to compromise their artistic integrity, which in practice meant that they are almost entirely absent from the recorded history of an event they absolutely performed at. Their set is largely undocumented. Their presence at Woodstock is known primarily to people who seek out the information specifically. They played one of the most significant concerts in history, and then essentially opted out of history's memory of it. Country Joe McDonald performed his anti-Vietnam War song, the one that begins with an audience participation spelling exercise that involves a word the radio could not play, to an audience of several 100,000 people in the middle of a field. The crowd participated enthusiastically and at volume. It remains one of the more remarkable instances of collective civic expression in American musical history, delivered in a form that rhymes and ends with a chorus. The documentary captured it. It has been watched by tens of millions of people since. Country Joe was not a household name before Woodstock. After it, the song was everywhere. Some performances find their moment. That one arrived exactly on time. By Sunday, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller was receiving briefings about the situation in Bethel that made it sound, from a distance, like something that required military intervention. There were reports of food shortages, sanitation failures, drug overdoses, traffic paralysis, and a crowd the size of a small city operating entirely outside any normal civic structure. Rockefeller contacted the organisers and told them he was considering sending in the National Guard. The organisers asked him not to. Rockefeller's concern was not unreasonable, given what he was being told. The reports reaching Albany described a situation that, stripped of its cultural context, resembled a medium-scale humanitarian emergency. Hundreds of thousands of people without adequate food or water, a road network in total collapse, a medical system operating well beyond its designed capacity, a county government that had not consented to host any of this and was now dealing with its consequences without the infrastructure to do so effectively. From a gubernatorial briefing room perspective, this is the kind of situation that has a standard response. Declare an emergency, deploy resources, restore order. The problem with that standard response in Bethel in August of '69 was the specific nature of what restoring order would mean in practice. The crowd was not violent. It was not rioting. It was not destroying property or threatening anyone. It was by and large sitting in a field and listening to music, sharing food with strangers, and managing its own internal logistics with an improvised but largely functional community structure. Introducing uniformed armed soldiers into that environment, into a crowd of 500,000 people, many of them in altered states, many of them young people, who had watched uniformed soldiers beat protesters at the Democratic National Convention 11 months earlier, was a scenario with a trajectory that did not require much imagination to follow toward its most likely outcomes. The organisers made this argument to Rockefeller, and he listened. The National Guard was not deployed. The official declaration of emergency was not made, though Sullivan County did eventually request and receive state assistance for the cleanup and the traffic management. The decision to keep the military out of Woodstock is, in retrospect, one of the most consequential calls of the entire weekend, made not by the organisers or the crowd, but by a Republican governor whose instincts, in this instance, happened to align with the outcome that the situation actually required. What Rockefeller did instead was authorise the use of military resources in a supporting role. Army helicopters flew supply missions. The National Guard provided some logistic support away from the festival site itself. The presence was real, but kept at a distance that allowed the crowd's own self-governing structure to remain the primary social order inside the fence. It was the right call, and it was not obvious that it would be the call that was made. The summer of '69 had not consistently demonstrated that authority figures in positions of power would choose de-escalation when faced with large gatherings of young people expressing countercultural values. That it happened here, that the governor held back, that the organisers made the argument successfully, that 500,000 people spent 3 days in a field without the intervention of armed authority, is one of the things that made Woodstock what it was rather than what it could have become. The line between those two outcomes was thinner than the mythology acknowledges. Wavy Gravy was not a trained paramedic, emergency manager, or logistical coordinator. He was the leader of a communal group called the Hog Farm, named for the actual hog farm in New Mexico where they had been living, and he arrived at Woodstock, having been hired somewhat experimentally to provide security for the festival. The Hog Farm's approach to security was, by any conventional standard, unorthodox. Their method for de-escalating confrontations was to offer the agitated party seltzer water and a cream pie. This sounds absurd, and it was, and it also remarkably worked. To understand the Hog Farm's role at Woodstock, you need to understand what they were before they got there. They were a commune, a travelling, intentional community of several hundred people who had been living collectively since the mid-1960s, first on an actual hog farm in New Mexico, then on the road, moving through the American West and eventually internationally, living experimentally and cheaply, and with a practical knowledge of what happens when large groups of people try to share limited resources under difficult conditions. They had, by 1969, more hands-on experience in communal improvised living than almost anyone else the organisers could have called. When the festival scale became apparent and the official support structures began to buckle, the Hog Farm moved naturally into the gaps. They had arrived with their own trucks and equipment, their own food supplies, their own organisational culture. They set up the free kitchen, a series of large pots producing granola, bulgur wheat, oatmeal, and whatever else they could prepare in volume, and operated it continuously, feeding thousands of people a day with the same systematic informality that characterized everything they did. You lined up, you got food, you moved on and someone else got food. There was no payment, no means testing, no bureaucracy. The operational simplicity was the point. The Bad Trip tent was perhaps their most significant contribution to the weekend survival. The medical team had the clinical protocols for handling acute psychiatric emergencies. What they didn't have in sufficient quantity was the specific combination of patience, experience, and non-alarmed presence that the Hog Farm volunteers brought to the task of sitting with someone who was in profound psychological distress and guiding them through it without escalating the situation further. The Hog Farm volunteers had done this before, not as professional service, but as a community practice. Because in a commune of several hundred people experimenting with consciousness in the 1960s, the skill of sitting calmly with someone having a difficult experience was simply a survival competency. They brought it to Woodstock, and it saved an unknowable number of people from experiences that would have been significantly worse. Wavy Gravy made several announcements from the stage over the weekend, becoming one of the more unexpected voices of the festival. He announced the free kitchen. He announced the bad trip tent. He delivered information with a warmth and humour that the official stage announcements sometimes lacked. He was, in a genuine sense, the human infrastructure of the festival, the warm connective tissue between the official programme and the 400,000 people who had arrived without a plan and needed someone to tell them where the food was. He wore a hat that looked like a bunny. He is now in his 80s. He's still, by all accounts, very much himself. The story of Woodstock is usually told from the inside, from the perspective of the performers, the organisers, the crowd. But the story of the surrounding community is equally fascinating and considerably less romantic. The residents of Bethel and Sullivan County did not ask for 500,000 people to arrive at their doorstep. Many were furious. Many had begged local officials to stop it before it started. And then it happened anyway, and something shifted. The shift did not happen all at once, and it did not happen everywhere. There were residents who remained angry throughout and afterward, and their grievances were legitimate. Their roads were destroyed, their local infrastructure was overwhelmed, their community had been transformed without consent into the host of an event that they had voted against, petitioned against, and organised against. The local newspaper had run editorials opposing the festival. Town meetings had been contentious. The people who lived in Sullivan County had done everything within the democratic process available to them to prevent this from happening, and it had happened anyway, and the mess was on their roads and in their fields and on their front lawns. And then the people started arriving hungry, and some of them started helping anyway. The mechanisms by which this happened were not coordinated or centrally organised. Individual people made individual decisions, often in the middle of the night, often in response to specific faces rather than abstract causes. A farmer saw people who looked lost and hungry and opened his barn. A woman with a large kitchen started making sandwiches and called her neighbours to come and help. A store owner unlocked his doors and told people to take what they needed and leave their names. A local contractor with a flatbed truck started ferrying supplies to the site boundary, because someone had to. The Monticello Jewish Community Centre became an improvised supply depot. Local hospitals activated emergency protocols not because there was mass violence, but because the sheer volume of people requiring minor medical attention had exceeded the region's normal capacity. The Sullivan County chapter of the Red Cross deployed. The county coroner's office coordinated with the medical team on site. The machinery of local civic life, institutions that had existed for purposes entirely unrelated to music festivals, turned itself toward the problem because the problem was there and required turning toward. None of this made the anger go away. Many of the residents who helped were still furious, before and after and during. The two things coexisted. Resentment at what had been done to their community without their consent, and the basic human response to people who are hungry or hurt or lost. The farmers who fed the crowd and the farmers who boycotted Max Yasgur's dairy were sometimes the same people. The Sullivan County residents who helped and the ones who didn't were neighbours. The lines were not clean. What the local community's response demonstrates, quietly and without drama, is that the civic infrastructure of ordinary American towns, the churches, the volunteers, the store owners, the contractors with flatbed trucks, has a capacity for improvised response that activates when the need is large enough and clear enough and right in front of you. Woodstock did not bring out the best in its logistical planning. It brought out something else instead. By the second day of the festival, the public health situation at Bethel had crossed from uncomfortable into genuinely alarming. Water contamination was a serious concern. The streams and ponds that people were bathing in were also, inevitably, being used for less pleasant purposes. Food safety was a secondary crisis. With no refrigeration infrastructure and food being distributed under chaotic conditions, the risk of mass gastrointestinal illness was real and mounting. State health officials were stationed outside the festival perimeter, receiving reports from the medical team on site and making their own assessments of the evolving situation. What they were tracking was the convergence of several independent risk factors that, individually, were manageable and collectively were alarming. Contaminated water sources, food of uncertain provenance being prepared and consumed without refrigeration in August heat, a crowd of several 100,000 people in close physical contact, many of them sleep-deprived and nutritionally depleted, which suppresses immune function in ways that increase susceptibility to whatever is circulating, and no functioning sewage system. The hepatitis risk was real and documented. In the weeks following the festival, hepatitis A cases in the region spiked above baseline levels. Hepatitis A is a waterborne illness transmitted through contaminated food and water and through close contact. All three transmission routes were present at Woodstock in abundance. The cases that appeared afterward could not all be definitively traced to the festival, but the epidemiological picture was suggestive. Public health investigators noted it in their reports. The gastrointestinal illness risk was similarly documented. Food prepared without temperature control in the conditions that existed at Bethel over those 3 days was food operating outside the parameters that food safety guidelines exist to enforce. Most of the improvised food distribution, the sandwiches made in church kitchens, the granola from the Hog Farm, the contributions from local residents was prepared with good intentions and relatively quickly distributed, which reduced exposure time. But the margins were not comfortable, and the number of people who spent portions of the weekend experiencing digestive distress that they attributed to something they ate was, by multiple accounts, significant. What prevented a declared public health emergency was a combination of the festival's short duration, the relative success of the improvised water distribution, and the fact that the conditions, while genuinely dangerous, did not quite reach the threshold of epidemic transmission before the crowd dispersed. 3 days is not long enough for certain waterborne pathogens to move through a population at scale if the population scatters before the incubation period completes. The crowd leaving was, from a public health perspective, the single most effective intervention of the entire weekend. Officials who reviewed the situation afterward noted, with the careful language of people who do not wish to alarm the public retroactively, that the outcomes had been better than the conditions warranted. That is public health language for, it was closer than we would like to admit and we got lucky. The field smelled the way it smelled for reasons that are now, from the safe distance of several decades, possible to describe with equanimity. At the time, they were reasons to be genuinely worried. When the last note faded and the last mud-caked attendee made their way back to their car, Woodstock Ventures sat down to assess the damage. The numbers were not good. The decision to abandon ticketing had cost the organisers the primary revenue stream. Stage construction, talent fees, and infrastructure had been paid for, largely from John Roberts's family money. The site itself was a ruin. 300 acres of farmland stripped of topsoil, littered with debris and permeated with waste. Let's construct a rough accounting of what the festival cost in $1969, because the gap between the plan and the reality is instructive. The talent fees alone, for a lineup that included Hendrix at $18,000, The Who at $12,500, Jefferson Airplane at $12,000, and dozens of other acts, totaled somewhere in the range of $180,000. Stage construction, which had been improvised and accelerated under a 6-week timeline, ran well over the original budget. The sound system, which was custom designed for the event, was expensive. Medical and sanitation infrastructure, while inadequate for the actual crowd, was not cheap. Food and logistics, particularly the helicopter operations that became necessary when the roads failed, added substantially. Legal fees, clean-up, compensation to Max Yasgur for the damage to his fields. The total expenditure has been estimated at somewhere between $2 and $3 million. Revenue, essentially nothing. The ticket sales that had occurred, approximately 186,000 tickets at an average of around $15, represented potential revenue of roughly $2.8 million that was never collected because the fence was not finished and the festival was declared free and the ticket booths were abandoned. Some reconciliation was attempted afterward. A portion of ticket holders received refunds, others received credits toward future events, but the money was gone. Woodstock Ventures ended the weekend millions of dollars in debt, with no assets other than the recordings and film footage that had been captured over 3 days. John Roberts, who had underwritten much of the deficit, spent years paying it off. The relationships between the four organisers did not survive the financial stress intact. Michael Lang and Artie Kornfeld had less personal exposure than Roberts and Rosenman, who had guaranteed the debts. The legal and financial untangling took the better part of a decade. There were lawsuits, there were renegotiated agreements, there was the specific grinding misery of managing a large bankruptcy while simultaneously watching the event that caused it become the most celebrated music festival in history. The documentary saved them. Michael Wadley's film, released in March of 1970, was a commercial and critical triumph. It grossed approximately $50 million in its initial release, a staggering return that cleared the debts, generated significant profit, and established the Woodstock brand as a commercial property with decades of revenue ahead of it. The albums followed, the licensing followed, the mythology followed. Woodstock lost money. The idea of Woodstock made a fortune, which is, if you think about it, a reasonable summary of how the 1960s worked as a financial proposition. Max Yasgur walked his fields on the Monday morning after the festival and found them transformed into something that no agricultural term quite captures. The gentle slope that had served as the natural amphitheatre was bare earth, the grass entirely gone, pressed into the soil by 500,000 pairs of feet. The surrounding areas were strewn with the physical evidence of 3 days of improvised living. Tents, sleeping bags, clothing, food packaging, musical instruments, vehicles, shoes, particularly shoes, for reasons nobody has fully explained. Let's linger on the landscape for a moment, because it deserves attention. The bowl of the natural amphitheatre, where hundreds of thousands of people had sat and stood and danced for 3 days, looked like a construction site. The topsoil was gone in the areas of heaviest traffic, not eroded exactly, but compacted and churned to a depth that would take years to recover. The grass that had made Yasgur's farm a farm rather than a field of dirt had simply ceased to exist under the combined weight of the crowd. Agricultural topsoil that takes decades to build can be destroyed in a weekend. This is not a metaphor, this is soil science. The debris field extended well beyond the main stage area. People had camped across hundreds of acres, and the campsite footprint of 500,000 people who were not carrying their belongings out with them because the traffic situation made carrying things to a car an impractical project was extensive. Cleanup crews documented the scale of what remained. Thousands of tents, many of them simply abandoned because their owners couldn't reach their cars. Sleeping bags, clothing of every description, food containers, musical instruments that had been brought to the festival and left behind, personal items whose significance was known only to the people who had left them. One consistent and unexplained feature of the post-festival landscape, noted by multiple cleanup workers and journalists who visited the site: shoes. Vast quantities of shoes, lone shoes, pairs of shoes, shoes that appeared to have been removed and simply never retrieved. The field of lost shoes became a minor journalistic curiosity. No one has fully accounted for them. The cleanup took weeks. Organised crews worked through August and into September, removing debris, hauling away abandoned vehicles, and beginning the agricultural restoration work on the damaged fields. The cost was significant and was absorbed partly by Woodstock Ventures as part of the settlement with Yasgur and partly by Sullivan County Resources. The restoration was not immediate. The fields that had been most heavily trafficked did not return to productive agricultural use for several seasons, and the ecological impact of what had happened to the soil took years to fully manifest and then years more to fully reverse. Yasgur walked the fields that Monday morning and did not, by any account, express regret. He had known what was coming to his land. He had made the decision with open eyes and a clear sense of what he believed. The land would recover. He was certain of that, and he was right, though he would not live to see the full extent of the recovery. He died 4 years later, at 53. The field is green again now. You would not know, standing on it on a quiet Tuesday in any recent year, what happened there across 3 days in August of 69. The earth has healed over it. But the slope of the hill is still the slope of the hill, and if you stand at the bottom of it and look up, you can still see exactly why it worked. 4 months after Woodstock, the Rolling Stones organized a free concert at the Altamont Speedway in Northern California, and the contrast between the two events became the defining argument about what the summer of 69 actually meant. Altamont was conceived quickly, organized poorly, and handed its security responsibilities to the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, who were paid in beer. The result was a day of escalating violence that culminated in the stabbing death of an 18-year-old attendee named Meredith Hunter during the Stones set, an event captured on film and later used as the de facto end of innocence moment of the 1960s. Let's talk about how Altamont happened, because the distance between it and Woodstock is not as large as the mythology suggests. The Rolling Stones had not played Woodstock. They were on a break, mid-tour, mid-lineup change, in the complicated aftermath of Brian Jones's death in July. But they had watched what Woodstock became and they wanted something like it. A free concert. A gesture of goodwill to the counterculture they had long orbited without quite being inside. The Stones were not idealists. They were pragmatists with excellent instincts for cultural positioning, and a free concert in California looked, in the autumn of 69, like exactly the right move. The planning was compressed into days rather than months. Venues were considered and rejected in rapid succession. The original plan was to use Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, which the city declined to permit. Altamont Speedway, a car racing venue in the East Bay Hills, was secured approximately 24 hours before the event. There was no time for infrastructure planning, no time for sanitation arrangements, no time for the kind of deliberate decision-making about crowd management that, even in the improvised, chaotic way it happened, had characterized Woodstock. The stage was low, barely raised above the crowd, which meant that the boundary between performers and audience was porous in ways that would become significant. The decision to use the Hells Angels as security is the one that history returns to most consistently, and it deserves examination rather than simple condemnation. The Angels had been used as informal security at previous events in the Bay Area counterculture scene without major incident. The logic was that they were present anyway, that they were a recognized part of the scene's social fabric, and that formalizing their role was better than having them participate as an uncontrolled variable. The compensation, beer, specifically a reported $500 worth of beer, established a dynamic that was, in retrospect, obviously problematic. You do not give several hundred members of a motorcycle club large quantities of alcohol and then ask them to manage crowd safety. This is not a complicated analysis. It required only that someone make it before the event rather than after. The violence at Altamont escalated through the day. Angels beat audience members with pool cues in front of the stage. Several serious assaults occurred before Meredith Hunter was killed during Under My Thumb. The Stones continued playing after the stabbing because they did not immediately know what had happened. The film crew captured it. The documentary of the Stones tour, Gimme Shelter, preserved it with a clarity that made turning away from it impossible. The comparison with Woodstock is not entirely fair. Altamont was a different event, organised by different people in a different cultural and geographic context under completely different conditions. But the comparison is made, and will continue to be made, because the two events happened 4 months apart and produced outcomes at opposite ends of the same question. What happens when you gather very large numbers of people, remove the normal structures of social order, and see what emerges? Woodstock's answer, imperfect and partial, was mostly generosity. Altamont's answer was something else. The difference was not luck. It was choices, specific, identifiable choices made by specific people in the days before each event. That is the part the mythology tends to blur, and the part most worth remembering. The festival itself lasted 3 days. The mythology has been accumulating for over 50 years, and it has not always been kind to the facts. The Woodstock documentary film, directed by Michael Wadley and released in 1970, was a masterpiece of editing and framing that shaped the public memory of the event almost entirely. The film showed the mud and the rain, but it also showed the beauty, the community, the music, the faces of young people behaving, against all probability, with remarkable generosity toward each other. The film was shot by a crew of over 100 people, an enormous documentary production for its era, using multiple cameras positioned throughout the site over the 3 days. The raw footage ran to hundreds of hours. What Wadley and his editing team, which included a young Martin Scorsese as one of the editors, produced from that footage was 184 minutes of carefully constructed argument that something extraordinary had happened in Bethel, that the crowd was the real story, that the music was inseparable from the community that received it. The editing choices that shaped this argument were deliberate and sophisticated. Certain footage was included, other footage was left on the floor. The film you can watch today is not a neutral record of what happened. It is an interpretation, a brilliant, humane, influential interpretation, but an interpretation nonetheless. What the film does not linger on, the sanitation crisis, the food shortage, the public health near miss, the financial implosion that was already underway as the cameras were rolling, the residents of Sullivan County who were furious and remained furious, the performers who had a terrible time, the people for whom the weekend was not a transcendent experience of community, but a miserable combination of hunger, exhaustion, and physical discomfort in a field with no working toilets. These things are present in the film, lightly, in glimpses. They are not the story the film tells. The story the film tells is the one that stuck. It stuck because it was beautifully made, and because it was released into a cultural moment, the spring of 1970, with the Vietnam War ongoing and the Kent State shootings weeks away, that was desperate for evidence that the previous decade had produced something worth holding on to. Woodstock the film arrived as a kind of proof. Look, here is what was possible. Here are your children in a field feeding each other and dancing in the rain. Here is 3 days of 500,000 people making something work through collective decency. The fact that the collective decency was partial, improvised, and accompanied by a financial catastrophe and a public health scare did not diminish the emotional force of the argument. It may have strengthened it. The albums reinforced the mythology. The anniversaries reinforced it. The academic analyses reinforced it. Woodstock became the name for an idea rather than an event. The idea that a generation had briefly demonstrated something about what human beings were capable of when the normal structures were removed. Whether the demonstration proved the idea or merely illustrated it for 90 minutes of edited documentary is a question that serious people disagree about. The mythology is more certain than the evidence warrants, but mythologies generally are. The gap between what Woodstock was and what Woodstock means has been one of the more productive gaps in American cultural history. Productive because it kept people asking what it would take to close it. And some of the things people built while asking that question were genuinely worth building. The real Woodstock was messier and more frightening and more human than the film. That is also true of most things worth remembering. Not everyone at Woodstock had a transcendent experience. Quite a few performers found the conditions somewhere between unpleasant and actively alarming. The Grateful Dead played a set widely considered one of their worst. The electrical system problems were affecting the sound equipment. Band members were experiencing the cumulative effects of the weekend, and Jerry Garcia later described looking out at the endless sea of people as something close to terrifying. The Grateful Dead's Woodstock performance is one of the more persistently discussed footnotes in the festival's history, primarily because it stands in such sharp contrast to the band's reputation and their subsequent mythology as the defining live act of their generation. They played Friday night in the rain, with equipment that was behaving unpredictably due to the moisture and the electrical complications that the storm had introduced into a system that was already being stressed beyond its design specifications. The sound was poor. The band was not in a state that favoured performance. The cumulative pharmaceutical and logistical weight of the weekend had settled on them in ways that were audible. Garcia looked out at the crowd and reportedly described it as the dark side of something, the shadow cast by the communal ideal that the day had been building toward. He was not wrong. 500,000 people in the dark in the rain is an experience with more than one dimension. The Who were furious about the scheduling. They had been booked for a specific time, and the delays had pushed them to a slot in the early hours of Sunday morning, somewhere around 3 or 4 a.m., depending on which account you read. Roger Daltrey has spoken about the experience with a retrospective warmth that was apparently not present in real time. Pete Townshend, never shy about his opinions, expressed himself more directly in the immediate aftermath. There was also the incident during their set in which Abby Hoffman, the activist, climbed onto the stage to make a political speech between songs. Townshend, who was in the middle of performing Pinball Wizard or close to it, encouraged Hoffman to leave the stage using his guitar as a persuasion tool. Hoffman left. Townshend continued. The crowd responded to the whole sequence with a combination of alarm and delight that was very 1969. Jefferson Airplane played at sunrise on Sunday morning, an accident of scheduling that became, by the time it happened, one of the stranger and more beautiful accidents of the weekend. Grace Slick addressed the crowd with the specific, alert energy of someone who had not slept and was not planning to, delivered a set that included Somebody to Love and White Rabbit as the sun came up over the hill, and later described the experience as one of the high points of her performing life. So the exhaustion and the scheduling failure produced something extraordinary, which is a reasonable summary of the weekend's operating principle. Ravi Shankar, the Indian classical musician whose presence on the bill reflected the festival's ambitions toward cultural breadth, performed in the rain with a graciousness that every account of the weekend describes as remarkable. He expressed concern about the conditions. He performed anyway. He described the experience afterward with a kind of measured, careful appreciation of a guest who had found their host's home in a state of significant disarray but had been treated with genuine warmth by everyone they met. His performance moved the crowd in ways that classical Indian music performed in a rain-soaked field in upstate New York had no obvious business doing, which is perhaps the most Woodstock sentence available. There's a persistent question underneath the Woodstock story that doesn't get asked often enough. What did the people in that field think they were doing? Many of them were there simply for the music. Many were there because their friends were going. Many had no particular ideology and no clear sense that they were participating in history. but a significant number of the people who made their way to Bethel in August of 69 were operating under a belief, fragile, earnest, and ultimately unprovable, that they were demonstrating something. To understand what that belief felt like from the inside, you need to understand what the summer of 69 felt like from the inside. The preceding 18 months had included the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. The Democratic National Convention of 68 had been followed by the image of police beating protesters on national television. The war in Vietnam was killing tens of thousands of Americans and an uncounted number of Vietnamese. The draft was real and the draft lottery was coming, and the question of whether you personally would be sent to Southeast Asia to participate in something you did not believe in was not abstract. It was a specific, dated, personally addressed possibility. The country felt, to many of the people in that field, like it was coming apart at its seams. And into that feeling came the idea of Woodstock, a gathering so large that it would constitute, by its sheer size, a kind of argument. Not an argument that could be made in a speech or a pamphlet or a petition. An argument made by the fact of 500,000 people being in the same place at the same time, choosing to be there, choosing music and community over the grinding machinery of a country at war with its own young people. The argument was not articulate. It did not need to be. The scale was the statement. What the crowd believed, or hoped, was that Woodstock would prove something about what their generation was capable of, that it would demonstrate a capacity for self-organisation, for mutual care, for the maintenance of social order without the apparatus of authority and enforcement that the adult world insisted was the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. Every day that passed without violence, every meal shared with a stranger, every person guided through a bad trip by a calm voice in a tent, these were data points in an argument the crowd was making to itself and to anyone watching from outside. Whether the argument was proven is a question that depends on what you think was being argued. The crowd at Woodstock did demonstrate something real about human capacity for improvised community under stress. It also demonstrated that the demonstration required a finite time horizon, a relatively homogeneous demographic, a specific set of cultural conditions, and a financial infrastructure provided by a trust fund, without which the whole thing would have collapsed on the first day. The communal experiment worked for 3 days. What that proves about longer-term human organisation is less clear. The crowd mostly did not think about this. They were in a field with good music and bad food and no dry socks, and they were young, and it felt like history. Sometimes feeling like history and being history are the same thing. Woodstock managed to be both, which is rarer than it sounds. After the festival ended and the crowd dispersed and the clean-up crews moved in, the stage stood for a while, a large, oddly beautiful wooden structure at the top of the natural bowl of Yasgur's farm, looking out over nothing. It was eventually dismantled. The wood was used for various purposes, some mundane, some sentimental. The site itself passed through several hands over the following decades, eventually becoming the Bethel Wood Centre for the Arts, a performing arts venue built on and around the original festival grounds. The history of the site between the festival and the current art centre is a history of competing ideas about what the place was and what it was for. In the years immediately after Woodstock, the land returned to agricultural use under Max Yasgur's management. Then, after his death in 73 under his family's, and eventually passed to other owners. For a long period, the site was simply farmland with a history, recognisable to people who knew what to look for, accessible to pilgrims who drove out to Sullivan County and stood on the hillside trying to feel something, but without any formal acknowledgement of what had happened there. The pilgrims came anyway. This is one of the quieter, stranger aspects of the Woodstock legacy, the persistence of the site as a place of informal visitation for people who had been there, or whose parents had been there, or who simply felt connected to what the place represented. They left things, flowers, notes, objects. The unofficial memorial quality of the site developed organically, without organisation or design, simply because people kept showing up and treating it as a place that mattered. The hill is that kind of place. There is something about its shape, the long, gentle slope, the natural bowl that focused the crowd toward the stage, that retains its character even without the stage or the crowd. You can see why they chose it. You can see how it worked. The Bethel Woods Center for the Arts opened in 2006, built on and around the original site with a deliberate architectural sensitivity to the history of the ground. The main performance pavilion sits near the location of the original stage. The landscape has been maintained in a way that preserves the shape of the natural amphitheatre. The museum, opened in 2008, holds a significant collection of artifacts from the festival, original tickets, posters, the clothing people wore, recording equipment, construction materials from the stage, the accumulated physical evidence of 3 days in August of '69. People still stand on the hillside, not in the hundreds of thousands, but in a steady flow, individuals, couples, families, groups of friends who drove up from the city for the day. They stand at the bottom of the slope and look up to where the stage was, and they try to imagine it. The scale is hard to grasp without the crowd. The hill looks gentle and manageable and quiet. It gives no indication, on an ordinary afternoon, of what it held for 3 days in '69. The imagination has to do the work of filling it, and the imagination, in this particular case, consistently finds the effort worthwhile. Some places accumulate meaning faster than time would seem to allow. The hillside at Bethel is one of them. Woodstock created legal and regulatory ripple effects that are still felt today in how outdoor music festivals are governed. In the months and years following the festival, New York State and municipalities across the country began reviewing their crowd management regulations, permitting requirements and emergency planning frameworks specifically in response to what happened in Bethel. The event had exposed, in real time, the almost complete absence of any legal infrastructure for managing a spontaneous city-sized gathering. The legal situation immediately following Woodstock was, from the perspective of anyone involved in it professionally, a significant mess. The contracts between Woodstock Ventures and the performers contained clauses that became disputed when the festival's financial collapse made payment uncertain. Several acts pursued the organisers for fees that had not been fully delivered. The agreements with local government entities, to the extent that any formal agreements had existed, were contested. Sullivan County and the town of Bethel had claims for cleanup and infrastructure costs. Max Yasgur's settlement for land damage was negotiated and eventually resolved. The insurance situation was, by all accounts, complicated in ways that took years of legal work to untangle. Beyond the immediate disputes, Woodstock prompted a fundamental rethinking of how municipalities govern large gatherings. The event had demonstrated that an outdoor concert could draw crowds an order of magnitude larger than any existing regulatory framework had anticipated. The permitting process that Wallkill had used to reject the festival, requiring permits for gatherings of more than 5,000, suddenly looked prescient in its instinct and inadequate in its scale. Regulatory bodies across New York State and then across the country began drafting new requirements. Capacity limits for outdoor events, minimum sanitation ratios per expected, attendee emergency planning requirements, medical infrastructure mandates, traffic management plans as conditions of permitting. The political fallout was subtler but real. Woodstock had given conservative politicians evidence for arguments they were already making about countercultural gatherings, that they were inherently disorganized, that they imposed costs on communities that had not consented to host them, that the romantic idea of spontaneous community masked real public safety risks. These arguments were not entirely wrong, and Woodstock did not make them easier to dismiss. The regulatory tightening that followed the festival was, in part, a political response as well as a practical one. For the organisers themselves, the legal aftermath was a sustained ordeal. John Roberts and Joel Rosenman spent years managing the debt and the disputes. The relationships between the four partners did not survive the pressure intact. The story of Woodstock Ventures after Woodstock is a story of litigation, negotiation, and the slow, unglamorous process of resolving what happens when something enormous goes both right and wrong simultaneously. They eventually recouped, primarily through the documentary and the music rights. But the recovery was a long time coming, and it cost more than money. What came out of the legal and regulatory reckoning in the end was a framework for outdoor events that now governs every music festival you've ever attended. The portable toilet ratios, the medical staffing requirements, the crowd capacity limits, the emergency evacuation plans, all of it has roots, directly or indirectly, in the gaps that Woodstock exposed. The regulations exist because Bethel in August of '69 demonstrated, comprehensively and publicly, what happens when they don't. The official histories of Woodstock are, by necessity, full of gaps. The accounts that made it into print, into documentary footage, into oral history archives tend to come from a particular slice of the crowd. Mostly white, mostly from the northeastern California, mostly with the cultural capital to have their stories taken seriously afterward. But 500,000 people were on that farm, and their experiences were not uniform. Sly and the Family Stone performed at Woodstock on Sunday morning, and their set is widely regarded as one of the festival's definitive moments, a performance of I Want to Take You Higher that moved the exhausted, rain-soaked crowd in ways that the more celebrated white rock acts had not quite managed. Sly Stone understood something about the crowd that he articulated through the music rather than words. That what 500,000 people in a field needed, after 2 days of rain and mud and logistical failure, was not profundity or complexity but rhythm and release, and the particular joy of a groove so good that your body moves before your mind has agreed to it. The crowd responded. The performance is preserved in the documentary. It is, by any measure, one of the great concert moments of the era. But the black experience of Woodstock extended beyond the stage, and it is less well documented. The festival's demographic was overwhelmingly white. The counterculture of the late 1960s drew disproportionately from white middle-class America, and the crowd at Bethel reflected this. Black Americans who were present, and they were present in smaller numbers, occupied a social space that the festival's mythology does not fully account for. The communal warmth that the documentary captures was real, and it was also not uniformly distributed. The racial dynamics of a 500,000 person gathering do not dissolve simply because everyone is listening to the same music. Women's experiences of the weekend are similarly underrepresented in the official record. The festival's mythology tends toward the communal and the collective, shared meals, shared shelter, shared music. The more difficult parts of the women's experience, including the specific vulnerabilities that come with being in a very large, very dense crowd, with no reliable infrastructure and limited safety structures, are present in some accounts and largely absent from others. The Woodstock documentary, made by a crew that was predominantly male, filtered the experience through a particular lens. What was left out is not a conspiracy. It is simply the normal operation of whose stories get told when the cameras are pointed by particular hands. Working class and rural attendees from outside the coastal counterculture are another underrepresented voice. Not everyone in that field was a college student from the Northeast, with a trust fund parent or a commune connection. Many people came from backgrounds that the festival's mythology does not particularly represent. People for whom the music was the point, not the politics, or for whom the politics were real but unconnected to the specific cultural signifiers of the counterculture. Their Woodstock was the same event and a different experience. Their accounts to the extent that they exist in accessible form, complicate the clean narrative in ways that make it more honest and more interesting. 500,000 people. One story that gets told. The distance between those two numbers is where the real history lives. The debris field at Woodstock has been documented, catalogued, and in some cases preserved. But the full picture of what 500,000 people left on 600 acres of Sullivan County farmland has never been entirely assembled. The physical evidence was staggering in its volume and its variety, the expected detritus of a large outdoor event, amplified by a factor of 10, and complicated by the fact that most people could not carry their belongings out because their cars were inaccessible. Cleanup crews worked through August and into September, and what they documented was a compressed archaeology of 3 days of improvised living at an extraordinary scale. The tents range from expensive backpacking equipment brought by people who had planned carefully to improvise shelters made from plastic sheeting and whatever was available, testimony to the range of preparation the crowd had brought with it. Sleeping bags, blankets, and clothing were left in quantities that required truck transport to remove. Musical instruments, guitars, flutes, hand drums had been brought to the festival by people who intended to play, and some were left when the walk back to the car outweighed the will to carry them. Food containers, cooking equipment, canteens and water bottles told the story of the weekend supply situation in physical form. The shoes remain the mystery. Multiple cleanup workers and journalists who visited the site in the days after the festival noted the unusual density of abandoned footwear. Not just individual shoes, pairs, collections, piles. The leading hypothesis is that people removed their shoes when the mud made wearing them more trouble, then going barefoot, then found their shoes when the festival ended but left them anyway, because wet, mud-filled shoes are not worth carrying. This is plausible. It is also unsatisfying as an explanation for the sheer quantity. The shoes of Woodstock are one of those details that accumulate a disproportionate imaginative weight. Small, ordinary objects left in a field by people who walked away without them, each one a small departure. What the crowd also left behind, and what the cleanup crews could not catalogue or remove, was the cultural residue of 3 days of collective experience. The conversations that happened in that field, the connections made between strangers who shared food or shelter, or a tarp during the rain. The specific quality of attention that a live performance receives from a crowd that has been through something together, the way music sounds different when the people listening to it have already been tested by the same conditions. None of this was recoverable after the fact. It existed in the field while it was happening and dispersed with the crowd when the crowd left. What 500,000 people leave behind when they leave is not only what can be picked up and carted away, it is also a shape, an impression in the culture of what was possible for 3 days, under specific conditions, in a specific summer. That impression has proven more durable than the topsoil, which grew back. It is still here. You're listening to a version of it right now. One of the more entertaining post-Woodstock sociological phenomena is the persistent expansion of the number of people who claim to have attended. The actual attendance has been estimated at between 400,000 and 500,000 people. The number of Americans who, over the subsequent decades, have told someone that they were at Woodstock is considerably larger. By some estimates, offered half-jokingly by cultural historians, if every person who has ever claimed to have attended Woodstock actually attended Woodstock, the crowd would have been approximately 3 million people, which would have required a significantly larger dairy farm. This is not a uniquely Woodstock phenomenon. The same arithmetic applies to other mythologized events. The number of people who claim to have been at pivotal concerts, significant sporting moments, historic speeches, tends to grow over time as the cultural weight of the event increases, and the social reward for having been present increases with it. But Woodstock has a particular version of this problem because the event's mythology attached itself so completely to an idea of generational identity. To say you were at Woodstock was to say something about who you were, what you believed, which side of the cultural divide you stood on. The claim became a form of affiliation as much as a biographical statement. The people who actually were there, the verifiable 400 to 500,000, have a complicated relationship with the mythology that grew up around their experience. Many of them report that the film, which they encountered after the fact, showed them a version of what they had been part of that was more coherent and more beautiful than their lived experience of it. They had been cold and muddy and hungry, and unable to see the stage clearly from where they were sitting. And then they watched the documentary and understood, perhaps for the first time, the full shape of what they had been inside. The mythology gave the experience a meaning that the experience itself, in real time, had not quite delivered. Others bristle at the mythology for different reasons. They were there for the music, and they found the music frequently hard to hear. They were there for the community, and they found the community occasionally uncomfortable and occasionally frightening. They had a bad weekend in a field, and they came home with an infection, and they do not particularly recognize themselves in the documentary's portrait of 3 days of radiant communal joy. Their Woodstock is also true, is less frequently quoted. The gap between the Woodstock that happened and the Woodstock that is remembered is not unique to this event. It is the normal condition of historical memory, which simplifies and elevates and selects. But Woodstock's gap is larger than most, because the event was large enough to contain many contradictory experiences simultaneously, and the mythology was powerful enough to paper over the contradictions with a coat of mud-brown, guitar-shaped legend that has proved 50 years later still remarkably resistant to the facts. In the 50-plus years since Woodstock, people have tried repeatedly to recreate it. The scale, the spontaneity, the feeling that an enormous number of people had briefly organized themselves into something approaching a functioning community without being told to. None of these attempts have succeeded. The attempts that have come closest to the spirit of the original have been small, accidental, and impossible to trademark. The fundamental problem with recreating Woodstock is that the original was not designed. It was the accidental product of a specific set of conditions that cannot be deliberately reproduced. A particular cultural moment, a particular generation with a particular set of shared experiences, a logistical failure that stripped away the commercial infrastructure and forced the crowd to depend on each other, and a set of choices made by specific individuals, Max Yasgur, the governor's office, the Hog Farm, the medical team, that determined the weekend's character as much as anything the organisers planned. Remove any of those elements and you have a different event. You cannot plan the fence breaking. You cannot plan the governor's restraint. You cannot plan for Wavy Gravy to arrive with a free kitchen and a philosophy of de-escalation by cream pie. These things happened because the circumstances that produced them happened, and the circumstances cannot be reproduced by writing them into a contract. The Woodstock anniversary concerts demonstrated this comprehensively. The 25th anniversary event in '94 attempted to capture the spirit of the original on a site in Saugerty, New York, with a more controlled and ticketed structure. It partially succeeded. The music was good, the crowd was large, and the event was mostly peaceful, but it felt like a recreation rather than an original, which is precisely what it was. The 30th anniversary in '99 in Rome, New York, is now a case study in what happens when you try to commercialize the anti-commercial, when you raise ticket and food prices for an event whose mythology rests on the memory of free sandwiches in the rain. The result was the event's famous and appalling final night, which demonstrated that what makes Woodstock good is not the size or the lineup or the 3-day format, but something that evaporates the moment you stop treating the crowd as the point and start treating them as the revenue. What the original Woodstock was, and what it remains, as a cultural idea rather than a historical event, is a record of what is possible when systems fail in the right direction. When the fence that was supposed to control access breaks and the event becomes free. When the food runs out and people share what they have. When the rain comes and the crowd waits and the music resumes and the mud becomes a souvenir. None of these things were planned. All of them were the festival. The lesson is not that you can recreate the conditions that produce those things. The lesson is that the conditions that produce them are present, latent, in any large gathering of people. That the capacity for improvised generosity is always there, waiting for the structures that usually suppress it to fail in ways that let it through. Woodstock happened once. It cannot happen again the way it happened then, but the things that made it what it was are not located in a field in Sullivan County or a summer in '69. They are located in people, the same people who were in that field and the people who came after them and the people listening right now in the dark. The fence broke, people walked in, they fed each other, they stayed for the music. And 50 years later the hill is still there, green and quiet, holding the shape of what it held, waiting for someone to stand at the bottom of it and try to imagine the rest. Close your eyes now, you're almost there. They were not all college students with trust funds and ideological manifestos. A significant portion of the crowd that converged on Bethel in August of '69 was made up of teenagers, some of them 18, some younger, some who had told their parents they were spending the weekend at a friend's house and were now standing in a field in Sullivan County with no tent, no money, and a growing suspicion that the friend's house story was not going to hold up on Monday morning. The teenage runaway contingent at Woodstock is one of the less celebrated demographic details of the festival, but it is part of the honest account. Picture the situation from the parents' end, which is an angle the Woodstock mythology rarely adopts. It is the summer of 1969. Your 16-year-old has been gone since Thursday. You've heard on the radio that there is a festival in upstate New York, attended by somewhere between 200,000 and, as the weekend progresses and the estimates climb, 500,000 people. The radio is also reporting food shortages, sanitation failures, and the presence of narcotics. Your child is somewhere in that field, and you cannot reach them because there are no cell phones. The telephone lines into the area are overwhelmed, and the roads are impassable. This is not a relaxing weekend for the parents of Woodstock. Some parents drove to Bethel and were stopped miles from the site by the traffic. Some called local police departments, who had their own problems to manage and limited capacity to locate specific individuals in a crowd of 500,000. Some waited at home with a specific grinding anxiety that the era did not have a name for, but that any parent of a teenager recognizes by feel. The vast majority of the runaway teenagers came home on Monday or Tuesday, muddy and exhausted, and in some cases profoundly changed, and the reckoning with their parents was one of the more private dramas of the post-Woodstock week. The teenagers who are there unambiguously and without parental knowledge occupy a particular place in the festival's social history. They were young enough that the music was not yet nostalgia. It was the present tense, the sound of the world they were growing into. They were old enough to understand that something significant was happening, but young enough to experience it without the self-consciousness that older attendees sometimes brought to. Their participation in events they understood to be historic. They did not know, in the moment, that they were making a story they would tell for 50 years. They were just there, in a field, in the rain, with no dry clothes and no plan, and the best music of the decade coming from a stage they could barely see. Some of them were there because of the music. Some were there because of the politics. The draft was real. The war was real. And for boys just a year or two from draft age, Woodstock was not simply a concert but a gathering of people who were going to have to live with the consequences of the decisions being made in their names. Some were there because their older siblings had told them to go, or because a friend had a car, or because the opportunity presented itself and they were 17, and the opportunity was Woodstock, and you do not say no to that. You find a way to get there, and you deal with Monday when Monday comes. Monday came, they dealt with it, and decades later, the ones who went would find themselves saying, in the way that people say things that are both true and slightly more than true, I was there, I was 17, I was in that field. And for the people who say it and mean it, the field is still there in their body somewhere. The cold, the mud, the music coming across the dark, and the feeling, fragile and specific to that summer, that the world was about to become something different. It didn't, quite, but for 3 days it felt like it might. At 17, that is enough to last a lifetime. Before a single note was played at Woodstock, before Hendrix or Joplin or the Grateful Dead took the stage, a team of audio engineers faced a problem that had no established solution. How do you deliver clear, balanced sound to an outdoor audience of potentially hundreds of thousands of people, spread across a hillside, using technology that had never been asked to do anything remotely like it? The answer they came up with was improvised, technically audacious, and, with significant exceptions, worked well enough to make the music audible to a crowd whose size had no precedent in live sound history. The lead audio engineer was a man named Bill Hanley, who had been building sound systems for outdoor events since the early 1960s and was, by 1969, the most experienced person in the country at the specific problem of outdoor amplification at scale. Hanley understood, from his previous work, that the challenge was not simply volume, it was distribution. A single large speaker cluster at the stage position produces enormous volume close to the source and then falls off rapidly over distance, leaving the back of the crowd with inadequate sound and the front of the crowd with a physical assault. The solution was to distribute the sound across the field using multiple speaker towers positioned throughout the audience area, each one carrying sound to its immediate vicinity rather than trying to push everything from the stage. Hanley designed and built a system specifically for Woodstock that used speaker towers placed at intervals across the hillside, tall structures supporting clusters of speakers angled to cover the area around each tower. The system was wired so that the signal from the stage could be sent to each tower with a slight delay calibrated to the distance, ensuring that the sound arriving from the nearest tower and the sound arriving from the stage were synchronized rather than producing the echo effect that ruins outdoor audio. This delay tower concept was not invented at Woodstock. Hanley had used versions of it before, but the scale at which it was deployed in Bethel was entirely new. The system worked. Imperfectly, as everything at Woodstock worked imperfectly. The rain created electrical complications, certain frequencies behaved unexpectedly over the terrain, and the sheer size of the crowd produced acoustic effects that no model had fully predicted. But the fundamental achievement was real. People standing 200 yards from the stage could hear the music clearly enough to know what song was being played and to feel its impact. For a crowd of that scale, in an outdoor setting in 1969, this was not a given. It was a genuine technical accomplishment, built under a 6-week timeline by a team operating at the outer limit of what the existing technology could do. The Woodstock sound system influenced the design of outdoor concert audio for decades afterward. The delay tower concept became standard practice for large outdoor events. The problems that Hanley's team encountered and solved, or partially solved, or failed to solve, but documented clearly enough that the next engineer could do better, became the curriculum for a generation of live sound engineers who learned from what happened in Bethel. The music you hear at outdoor concerts today, the clarity of it, the way it reaches you regardless of where you're standing in the field, has a direct lineage that runs back to a hillside in Sullivan County and a team of engineers building something impossible in 6 weeks, because the alternative was silence. The performers complained about the monitors. The performers always complain about the monitors. But the crowd could hear the music, and in a field with 500,000 people, that was the miracle that mattered. The day before Woodstock officially began was, in several respects, more chaotic than the festival itself. By the evening of Wednesday, August 13th, 2 full days before the music was scheduled to start, the roads into Bethel were already impassable. The people arriving were not late arrivals racing to beat the crowd. They were the crowd, and the crowd had decided collectively and without coordination that arriving early was the correct strategy. It was a reasonable conclusion. It was also a conclusion reached by several 100,000 people simultaneously, which is how a reasonable strategy becomes a 20-mile traffic jam. The people who arrived on Wednesday and Thursday experienced something that the people who came for the official opening on Friday did not. The construction of the thing they had come to attend. The stage was not finished when the early arrivals got there. The fencing was still being installed, or rather, was still theoretically being installed, since the practical reality of completing it had already begun to look doubtful. The sanitation units were being positioned. Food vendors were setting up. The site was a construction zone and a campground simultaneously, populated by workers with tools and festival goers with sleeping bags occupying the same muddy acres. What happened among the early arrivals in the hours and days before the music started has been described by everyone who was there as something that felt distinct from the festival proper, quieter, stranger, more intimate in its way. People set up camps and introduced themselves to their neighbours. Fires were lit. Food was shared from whatever people had brought. Musicians who had come as audience members rather than performers played in small groups around the campfires. The social infrastructure of the festival, the informal networks of mutual aid and shared space that would hold the crowd together through the difficulties of the official weekend, was assembled in these preliminary hours, person by person, camp by camp, before the stages were ready and before the world was watching. The mood in those early hours was, by multiple accounts, something close to giddy. The scale of the gathering was apparent to everyone present, and the scale was exciting before it was alarming. People had driven from hundreds of miles away, had navigated the traffic, had found a place to put down a sleeping bag, and were looking around at tens of thousands of other people who had made the same journey and the same choices, and feeling the specific pleasure of being part of something larger than themselves without yet knowing how much larger it was going to get. By Thursday evening, the trickle had become a flood. The estimates of crowd size that were circulating among the organisers on Thursday night were alarming enough that several contingency conversations were happening simultaneously about the fence, about the food supply, about whether to call the governor's office, about what to do when the number crossed a threshold that the infrastructure could not support. The organisers were making decisions in real time with incomplete information and accelerating pressure. Meanwhile, outside the conversations and the calculations, the people who had come were sitting around fires in the dark, talking to strangers, listening to impromptu music, watching the stars over Sullivan County, and feeling, with the particular certainty of the young in a significant moment, that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. They were not wrong about that. They were simply not yet aware of what being exactly where you're supposed to be sometimes costs. The music ended. The field emptied. And then approximately 500,000 people attempted, more or less simultaneously, to drive home. The Monday morning that followed Woodstock was, from a traffic management perspective, an event almost as significant as the festival itself, a slow-motion dispersal of a temporary city, conducted without coordination, across a road network that had been under sustained stress for 5 days and was now being asked to absorb the full weight of the exodus at once. The cars that had been abandoned along Route 17B and the surrounding roads over the preceding days were still there. Their owners had to walk back to them, sometimes miles before they could begin the drive home. Many of the cars had flat tyres from sitting on road shoulders. Many had been blocked in by other cars that were themselves blocked in, producing a puzzle of vehicular interdependence that required hours of patient manoeuvring to resolve. Some cars had been sitting in the August heat long enough that their batteries were dead. The sounds of Monday morning in Sullivan County included, alongside the retreating music and the clean-up crews beginning their work, the particular sound of jump-start cables being applied to dead batteries across a 20-mile radius. The people driving home were not, by and large, in the condition that driving typically requires. They had slept on the ground, or not slept at all. They had eaten irregularly and in many cases insufficiently. A significant number had spent the weekend in states of consciousness that Monday morning driving does not accommodate. State troopers who work the roads after the festival noted the specific quality of exhaustion they encountered in the drivers they stopped, not the aggression of a difficult crowd, but a profound, damp, satisfied tiredness that was not quite compatible with the operation of motor vehicles at highway speed. The New York State Thruway reopened in stages. Local roads were cleared in order of priority. Volunteers from the festival and from the surrounding communities helped direct traffic, helped people find their cars, helped push vehicles that had gotten stuck. The dispersal took most of Monday and extended into Tuesday for the furthest reaches of the traffic backlog. Hitchhikers were everywhere on the regional highways, people who'd lost their ride or whose car had not survived the weekend or who had simply decided that the fastest way home was to stand by the road with a hand out and trust the goodwill of the people driving past. The goodwill was, by most accounts, still running. Rides were offered. Strangers continued to share whatever they had, including this time the back seats of cars. The people driving home were carrying something with them that was more than mud on their boots, and less than the mythology that would later accumulate around what they had been part of. They were carrying the specific private knowledge of having been in a particular place at a particular time, and having had a particular experience that was theirs, and not the documentary's version, and not the album's version, and not the historical record's version. The drive home was the first moment of translation, the beginning of the process by which the lived experience became the story became the memory, and the memory became something larger than either. The field behind them was already beginning to be cleaned. The roads ahead were already beginning to clear, and somewhere in the cars moving slowly north and south and east and west away from Bethel, 500,000 private Woodstocks were already becoming one. And so, here we are. At the end of 3 days in a field that the world was not supposed to see and somehow could not look away from. 500,000 people arrived without a plan, without enough food, without working toilets, without dry socks, without any reasonable expectation that the whole thing would hold together. The fence broke. The roads failed. The food ran out. The rain came. The systems that were supposed to manage and contain and organize all collapsed one by one in full view of everyone, and the people fed each other anyway. That is the thing that doesn't fit neatly into the mythology or the cynicism, the thing that resists both the golden-hued documentary version and the knowing revisionist account. In the middle of a logistical catastrophe, in the mud and the heat and the dark, surrounded by strangers, 500,000 people made a series of small, ordinary, irreplaceable decisions to share what they had. Food, space, a tarp in the rain, a calm voice in a tent, a sandwich made at 2 a.m. in a church kitchen by someone who had never planned to be there. These were not grand gestures. They were not historic acts of courage or sacrifice. They were just people tired and hungry and wet looking at other people who were also tired and hungry and wet, and deciding that sharing was easier than not sharing. History is mostly made of exactly that. Not the speeches or the monuments or the names that end up on the plaques. The small, repeated, unglamorous choices of ordinary people who looked around at the mess they were in and decided without fanfare to help. The people who were at Woodstock are in their 70s and 80s now, or they are gone. The ones who are still here carry something specific that cannot be transferred. The physical memory of that hillside, the sound of the music over the dark, the feeling of a particular August night in a particular field in a year, when everything felt like it was either breaking apart or coming together, and nobody could tell which. They carried it home in their muddy boots and their ruined sleeping bags, and they have been carrying it since, through everything that came after, through all the years that were not Woodstock, through the long ordinary life that follows every extraordinary weekend. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your clean bed, in your warm room, with running water and a roof that does not leak, and a phone you could use to order food at any hour you choose, tonight, spare a quiet thought for the people who sat in a rain-soaked field and waited for the music to come back on. They did not know they were making history. They were just there. They were cold and they were young and the music was real and the person next to them was a stranger who offered them something to eat. That was enough. That was, it turns out, more than enough. The hill is still there. The music is still there. And somewhere in the part of you that knows how to listen in the dark, so are you. Sleep well.